Awesome. So again, hello everyone. Welcome to July's Tenant Talk Live. We're going to be talking about, dispelling the myths of the scarcity and immigrant crisis myths. For folks that are newer here, my name is Sid Betancourt and I use she, they pronouns. I'm a project manager for inclusive community engagement at NHLP. And for folks who might need a refresher on the meeting itself, you're currently joining Tenant Talk Live, where we provide opportunities for tenants to connect with NLHC and one another and share best practices and learn how to be more involved in federal housing policies and leading within their communities. And for folks who might want to share this with their friends later, we are going to upload this recording to YouTube afterwards. And we do have a few awesome guests joining us today, but before I turn it over to them, I just want to do a brief our brief updates and just like our general beginning with our community agreements for today. Let me share my screen. Awesome. So as you can see here are community agreements that we did for 2024 earlier this year. The platinum rule: treat others the way they want to be treated. So in other words, please consider how others might want to be treated and how that might differ from how you want to be treated. Muting your mic except when speaking. If you're not able to hear me, I might have to mute you myself, and I apologize ahead of time, but I just want to give you a fair warning ahead of time. And then just listening with an open mind and empathy, taking up space, but also making sure that you give space to others. And then just a reminder for folks who might be newer that this is recorded and shared online afterwards. So if there's any sensitive information you don't want to share publicly, just something to be aware of. But if y'all have any feedback or anything that you would like to share on these guidelines or agreements, you can always feel free to email me that feedback. But again, if you are signed up for our emails, you should be receiving an email every Friday called The Connection, and it has an e-blast to all of our, or it has an article in there for all of our webinars throughout the week, including this one. So make sure you're signed up for our emails, and we'll make sure to also share last month's resources in the chat if you missed them. And then just some logistics. Please make sure to use the chat for any questions that you might have that come up throughout the call. And also just remember to please stay muted. I want us to be in community together, and I want us to see our faces if you want to share your screen, but also make sure that we're like respecting each other's time and stuff. So now I'm going to turn it over to our first guest for today, Kayla Laywell, who is a policy analyst with NLHC, and she'll be providing a brief policy update that also includes a small glimpse into next month's Tenant Talk Live topic.
Thanks, Sid. Hi, everyone. My name is Kayla Laywell. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a policy analyst here at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. I'm going to talk to you today about our Tenants' Bill of Rights, putting some links in the chat real quick. All right. So last week, NLIHC, together with the National Housing Law Project, or NHLP, and the Tenant Union Federation, or TUF, launched the National Tenants' Bill of Rights. This signifies a groundbreaking step in shifting power to renters and advancing tenant protections. Written with direct input from tenant leaders, people with lived experience of housing instability, housing law experts, and advocates nationwide, the National Tenants' Bill of Rights provides a bold legislative framework to enshrine tenants' rights throughout their tenancy in both private and federally assisted properties. Solutions to our nation's housing crisis must include strong and enforceable tenant protections to help prevent housing instability and homelessness, redress longstanding racial and social inequities, and advance housing justice. We are urging all advocates, including individuals, organizations, elected officials, and candidates for elected office, to endorse the National Tenants' Bill of Rights. And I put that link in the chat. I'm going to give a broad overview today, and then I'll be back next month to talk about a few more details. So, The National Tenants Bill of Rights, again, it's a practical and comprehensive policy agenda that affirms the government's duty to provide all renters with basic protections from abusive and predatory landlords. When enacted, the National Tenants Bill of Rights will strengthen and enforce the rights of all renters, including those in federally subsidized housing, as well as renters in the private market. Our nation's 114 million tenants deserve a stable, safe, and healthy home. So what is in this National Tenants Bill of Rights? It sets out 7 essential rights that establish a baseline of tenant protections in the rental housing market. These rights follow a tenant's experience from applying for housing, signing a lease, living in their home, and eventually ending their tenancy. The National Tenants Bill of Rights would establish a baseline of tenant protections, including the right to a fair application, the right to a fair lease, the right to freedom from discrimination and harassment, the right to a habitable home, the right to reasonable rent and costs, the right to organize, and the right to safeguard against evictions. A little bit on each of those 7 rights real quick. So on the right to a fair application, everyone should get a fair shot in the application process. Landlords should only consider information relevant to an applicant's obligations as a tenant. This section includes components like tenant screening and application requirements. The second, the right to a fair lease. Leases shape the landlord-tenant relationship and should clearly define the duties and rights of both to avoid predatory and deceptive terms. The third is the right of freedom from discrimination and harassment. No one should face discrimination, violations of privacy, or harassment in their homes by their landlords. Tenants should have the tools to prevent and stop such abuses. Fourth is the right to a habitable home. Habitable, that's a tough word. When tenants face a health or safety hazard or need a repair in their home, they should have a clear way to communicate with their landlord who should make a prompt fix. Sixth, I'm sorry, I'm losing count. I should number these. I'm sorry. Fifth, the right to reasonable rent and costs. To protect tenants from financial shocks that put them at risk of eviction, safeguards are necessary to prevent rent gouging and excessive or hidden fees. And sixth, the right to organize. We have a lot of strong leaders in this space. Tenants must have the ability to advocate for themselves without fear of retaliation or eviction from landlords, owners, or property management. And then finally, the right to safeguards against evictions. Thank you. Finally, just again on the 7th right, the right to safeguard against evictions. Due process is a basic right we all have, including tenants. Tenants should also have protections from illegal evictions and evictions without good cause. So that is the National Tenants Bill of Rights. Again, I'm going to put the link to the full National Tenants Bill of Rights, as well as the link for endorsements in the chat. We're calling again for individuals, organizations, including tenant unions, tenant associations, and elected office. We're hoping to use this to mobilize around the 2024 elections. So I'll put my email in the chat as well. And if you have any questions, I can answer a couple in the chat, but I'll also be back next month. Thank you all so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kayla. And like she said, we're going to be having a whole Tenant Talk Live dedicated to the Tenant Bill of Rights next month. So any questions, feel free to save them until then, but you can also email Kayla at the email she just put in the chat if you have any. Again, thank you so much, Kayla. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started with our programming for today. I'll introduce our guest for the night. I'll begin by introducing Sarah Armour-Jones, who uses she, her pronouns and is the Deputy Director of the Housing Narrative Lab. And in that role, she focuses on strategic partnerships, communications, and organizational growth. We also have Kate Walz joining us. She is the Associate Director of Litigation at the National Housing Law Project, also known as NHLP. And in that role, she serves as the national expert on federally assisted housing preservation, fair housing, crime-free, and nuisance property ordinances. And the Violence Against Women Act, which was really important to this work, and then also the intersection of the criminal legal system and housing access. So thank you both for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to Sarah first to get us started.
Thanks so much, Sid. I really appreciate it. And thanks, Kayla. It's great to be here. There's some background noise. So if you can just double check that you're muted, that would be really helpful. Thank you, folks. I'm really happy to be here with you. So Sid gave a really nice formal introduction. A little bit just about the lab is that we work to change what people think and feel about the root causes of homelessness on unstable housing, so that we can build a bigger base of support for real solutions. And we do this through narrative change work, because we know that we can't really change what people will support until we change what they think and feel. And you change what people think and feel through stories. And that's TV, movies, Netflix, podcasts, books, radio, face-to-face conversations in the cafe, at your kid's soccer game, wherever you are. Stories are incredibly powerful. They are the thing that move people through emotion. They make people reconsider. They make new ideas sort of palatable or like agreeable. They are just incredibly powerful. And I think the situation that we're in is really the result of decades or centuries of stories that have not been helpful for our work. Centuries of narratives around deservedness and poverty and wealth and who's good and who's not, and individual responsibility and all of those things. So that's the work of the lab, and we're thrilled to be here with you all tonight. And I just want to say, coming off of Grants Pass, it's really good to connect with folks just who are doing this work, and because it's hard work and it's good, and it feels right to come off of that really rough ruling and be in community with folks. So thank you. I want to share just a couple of things this evening. First, I want to talk about how some amazing community members are really like addressing tensions around immigration, asylum seekers, housing, and homelessness that we're seeing. I want to share a couple of insights from a recent webinar that we had with some great journalists who are finding ways to really cover these issues with real nuance. And then I want to just share a little bit of resources from the lab that can help you in your conversations and your own work, because you are narrative change agents. The conversations that you have, whether it's online, whether it's face-to-face in your work, in your private life, like you are part of the work to change how people think and feel about homelessness, unstable housing, eviction, tenants, renters, and everything in between. And then we'll turn it over to Kate, who's going to share some really great background information on the law. So I'm just going to say what you already know, that this work is challenging. It's really hard. And communities are squeezed and struggling. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that. We are seeing a lot of folks getting pitted against one another, stories that sort of push an us versus them narrative. Maybe, folks who are newcomers who need a safe place to live versus folks who have been on waiting lists for a really long time and need a safe and affordable and stable place to live, right? And so it's putting a huge strain on everyone, particularly folks in in the nonprofit sector, because they're stepping up in ways that government isn't. And it keeps us in this cycle of emergency and reaction. And frankly, it pits us against one another. So we saw, Seattle is this perfect example. If you saw about this single church that's receiving like thousands and thousands of folks who are coming in, while the government's doing pretty much nothing. The city says the county needs to do it. The county says the state needs to do it, and on and on and on and go. And I can actually just drop that link. Sid, I think I can drop this in, right? Here's this article in the Seattle Times that definitely worth your read. But obviously not just Seattle, right? Chicago, Boston, families are sleeping in Logan Airport overnight and then getting bused to sort of like day shelters, right? So none of this is working. And instead of kind of pushing government to solve this, there's a lot of sort of blame and focus on punishment being the theme coming out of Grants Pass, obviously. But what we would sort of want to reiterate is that anytime we're like pitting folks against one another, we are undermining our collective work to make, to refocus folks on government who are supposed to work for us, right? And to focus on the need for more housing for people of all backgrounds, no matter how long they've been here, everybody needs a safe and affordable place to live. So we want to really avoid that classic move of pitting folks against one another. And that to us is really comes down to like sharing a new narrative, a new way of thinking about things. And I was in a meeting last week that just fortuitously heard from two folks who do, oh, thanks, Lauren, for sharing that. No longer allowed to stay in Logan overnight. Okay, thank you for that update. Anyway, talking to these two folks, they were presenting, and they shared really thoughtful pieces that I wanted to share with you. So first was Roderick Wilson from Keep Illinois Home in Chicago. I don't know if folks know him. And he was talking about tensions in Chicago because of resources going to asylum seekers, right? Especially when Black communities have been disinvested for so long. And he was really speaking to his community. And he said he was talking about the need to educate folks about why people are coming to Chicago, like what is driving them, particularly from places like Venezuela or Haiti, like what's going on, often like US backed policies that are creating the situations in these countries. And he said that that's been really, really helpful in sort of mitigating some of the tensions in these communities, because it helps folks know like the full story, right? It's not an us versus them. It's an actually like we're all in this hard situation together. And I thought that that was really just a really awesome way of focusing on education. Like, do you know why folks are coming? And then Sandra Dennis from Miami Workers Center, who's Haitian, talked about how they do some really, really, really deep intersectional work across housing and immigration and labor. For them, it's like all three, like there aren't separate issues. And she was saying that they really see a clear need to organize people in solidarity and double down on the like, we're all experiencing the same thing. We have a common opponent, we have a common problem, and it's not each other. And so she was really sharing how talking about like, this country has enough. We have enough. We all can thrive here, and like really calling out the pitting against one another narrative and refocusing on there is really plenty. It's not immigrants making housing unaffordable. It's not asylum seekers who didn't make enough housing, right? That's not the situation. It's the powers that be. It's the rules that we've had, and it's the investments and the policy decisions and the budget decisions that this country has made for a really, really, really long time. And one thing that Sandra shared, which I thought was really cool, is that they get together really intentionally in joy. And she talked about they do karaoke in 3 languages, which I thought was super, super cool. And she said that like that's really how they gauge that they're making progress in their work in solidarity. Yeah, Sid, I know, I love it. And she said one of the impact metrics, which I know a funder will never ask for, was when their kids start asking to go to one another's parties or hang out. So if somebody wants to go to a friend's quinceanera, or if they want to go to like a Sweet 16, or they want to go hang out and game, that's when they know that they're really doing like the deep community oriented work, because their kids are asking to hang out together. So I thought that was really super cool. And I wanted to actually ask folks, if you have any efforts like Sancha, or yeah, thank you for sharing that. Oh, thank you so much, Kate. I appreciate you sharing that, but I'd love to hear from others. Do you have organizations that you think are doing really, really impactful, like intersectional work to bring people together and really like double down on the immigrants and asylum seekers and tenants we're all in this together. This is not a like us versus them. I'd love to see any more examples of that. And if anybody in particular is doing karaoke in 3 or 4 languages, I would definitely love to hear about that. So drop it in the chat if you want to share anybody who's doing that work, and then I will just kind of motor along, because I know we got to get to some other folks here. So I mentioned earlier that we had a recent webinar like a couple weeks ago with 2 journalists who are covering immigration, asylum, and housing and homelessness issues. And they're doing it with really a lot of nuance. They are very intentional about their work, recognizing that this is complex and that there are some really big systems at play. I just wanted to stop and see yeah, a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric doing rural and trips around housing. Yeah, resources, you're getting to that. Totally. Hold on, like 2 minutes. We are absolutely going to get to that point. I just want to show that like some of these articles can also be resources for folks to kind of point to be like, oh, right, like this is the journalist is like covering this with like nuance and care. So Abdullah Fayyad of Vox points out that the US actually has a system to support people who are coming in waves, and that's the refugee settlement system. And I really appreciated the way that Abdullah sort of helped me rethink like the systems, right? Like, oh, actually, we can do this really well. Refugees arrive, they get housing support, access to assistance, cash, coordinated entry, placement, language classes, work permits, all this stuff. But asylum seekers who are often fleeing the same terrible situations get none of that, right? And often don't have the ability to work. Kate's going to talk about some folks who can get into housing programs and others who can't, obviously, depending on like which category they come in with. So I think their articles are really like worth reading and sharing. And it made me think like, what if we start talking about, you know, asylum seekers in a way of like refugee settlement, right? What if we start talking about like the moral obligation or the ability with a country as rich as ours to make sure that everybody can kind of land here and succeed and that everybody has a home. So even if it's not like a model, and Kate might be like, please don't open up that, you know, like can for us to muddle through, but I think it is interesting to talk about it, right? Like when we talk about what people are going through and why they come here, and we talk about the fact that we have enough if we choose to spend it in the way that will make sure everybody has a safe place to live and an affordable place to live. Like, and those are some of the conversations that really get out the blame game against vulnerable groups and start focusing the blame on the people that really take it, which is, you know, government. Which isn't to say all government's bad. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying like we really don't want to be pointing fingers at other folks who are also just trying to survive. So how and what we say is super important. I'm going to just say a couple of things and I'm going to share a few examples. We don't talk about crisis. We don't talk about emergency, partly because even though I think it's fair to say we have a rental affordability crisis, absolutely. We're going to say that inside with this group, but we are not going to say that out and about in the world because crisis and emergency make people go really insular. It makes them feel sort of protective and defensive, and it also makes people feel like there's nothing that can be done. And we definitely don't want to kind of share that opinion. People are frustrated, and we want to sort of reorient their frustration and turn it towards the people in power who can actually do some stuff. So I'm going to share a couple of examples, and then Sid's got some links for us. The lab created some talking points and some messaging, both in English and Spanish, and we invite you to download them, take them, share them. They're free to use, and we'd love your feedback, certainly. So one thing like government coordination, we might want to sort of rephrase somebody's criticism and say, you know, in a country as powerful and as rich as ours, we have the resources to provide everyone who needs a safe and affordable home one, right? When we focus on solutions and demand that our local and state leaders work together, we can solve homelessness for people who have lived here for years and for people who have just arrived. We definitely want to call out the blame game, right? We want to really clearly talk about who we're blaming on this, right? So remind people of the job of elected officials. Like, it is actually their job to make our city or state or county work and meet the needs of its residents. And I think sometimes we forget that. So something like housing is too expensive for all of us. You know, people living on the streets or doubled up in tiny apartments didn't make it expensive. Neither did asylum seekers coming to the city. The housing crunch we have today is because our city and state and federal leaders haven't built or preserved enough housing for decades. So now everyone's pressed for a place to stay. Don't be fooled by politicians who blame people fleeing violence for our problems, right? So the don't be fooled is really important because it's like, it's almost inoculating people for falling for that trap, and it like calls it out, like don't be fooled for that stuff. We also have found in all of our research that focusing on solutions is incredibly important. And I want to acknowledge that like just saying like we need to build more housing is not always particularly helpful because it takes a really long time. And it's like people are like, well, what about now, right? So we want to give specifics like we know what works to make sure everyone, longtime residents and asylum seekers have a place to call home. We can expand rental assistance. We can convert unused buildings and preserve the supply of affordable homes. So you're giving kind of three things, right? Like we could do vouchers. We can expand rental assistance. We can create new housing. And that's a way that people can kind of get their heads around the fact like, oh yeah, like we could actually do this. And we also really want to kind of focus on pride. Like a lot of the talking points that Sid just shared came from conversations that stemmed from like what was happening in New York with Mayor Adams. And so there's like a pretty big section there that's New York City specific. But I would say every city and town can sort of incorporate those ideas and make them their own, right? So, you know, New York is the place that, you know, everybody goes to, and like it's been a hub of immigration for years. And so we're like, don't tell me we can't take in more people. Like, that's nonsense. Like, we can make room for new people. We always have. That's a New York pride thing. And so Chicago will have its others. Philadelphia will have its others. You know, Seattle will have its others. So you really make it personal, and you kind of like dig into the pride that people have in their community and be like, don't tell me we can't figure this out. Like, we're smarter than that. So I'm just gonna, I think, wrap up there and scroll through the chat to see if there's anything that I could, okay. I'm hoping that I answered that question. V, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but I wanted to know, like, is that helpful to have those talking points and to have those kind of specific resources? I hope that that is what you're looking for. And yeah, Claudia, it is definitely a housing problem and the lack of it, right? But it's like the people who are coming here or people who are renting, they didn't make that problem, right? But I think sometimes like we get pitted against one another, and that like takes all the blame off of the folks who are in power. So we definitely want to double down on community and really like not being very intentional about not blaming people as we're like struggling for crumbs. Instead, like really pointing the finger and turning around and being like, no, you know, like we have enough. We can do that here. Rural areas. Oh, that's so interesting. I was just sharing that I live in Vermont, and the housing and homelessness issues are really different in rural areas. So I would say that like my example from my rural area would be something along the lines of like, you know, we look out for one another. Like it's tough, you know, like rural communities really look out for one another, and like we take care of each other. That's kind of like part of the ethos of surviving in a rural community. And so like I want to see us doing that and making sure that everybody has a place to live here. And even talking about like we want new people to come here because that's how rural communities survive and thrive, right? Like so when we have people coming here, they're like reigniting our economy. Our schools don't close when we have kids in them, right? So we want to kind of frame it in the positive asset, and thinking about like downtowns become more vibrant. There are more people, you know, there are more people in the workforce, there are more kids in the schools, and those are, you know, like those are good things. And like we want folks, reminding folks about the positive benefits, I think are particularly helpful. So anyway, on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Kate, and happy to take any questions towards the end. Thanks, folks.
That was great, Sarah. I learned a lot. I'm based in Chicago, as Sid said, but I live in a nearby community called Oak Park. It's a neighboring suburb, and we had close to 100 migrant families come to our community, and they were staying at police stations. There was nowhere for them to go, and so it was, as Sarah noted, largely a volunteer effort. There was a little bit of government assistance, but largely mutual aid to help these families. And, you know, I can say at this point, 75 families are in just regular rental housing and are gaining employment and really making their way. But it was because there wasn't sufficient government support. But this is a community that really believes in being welcoming. We were able to come together and fundraise and get a little bit of money from the state as we move this forward. So just appreciate the talking points and guidance. I'm going to talk about the law, because I think part of oftentimes what you hear when people are coming up with their concerns and this us versus them mentality is also false information about a person's eligibility for federal housing assistance. So I'm going to try to arm you with some of the information. It's messy, so I'm going to give you a couple of cheat sheets. Let me get these. So the first one is a more lengthy, detailed guide that's going to go through every federal housing program and all the other federal benefits that help in terms of housing, homelessness assistance, emergency disaster relief, energy assistance, and water assistance. The second one is a very nice cheat sheet that the Coalition, NHLP, and the National Immigration Law Center worked on. That's sort of a yes, no, do you have to have immigration restrictions or not, depending on the program. So these are good ones to have, and I'm going to give you, the second one is also in Spanish. So we'll put that one in the chat too. And we update those as laws and policy change. As you can imagine, it changed a lot from the prior administration to the Biden administration. So what I'm giving you today, I'm not an immigration lawyer, I'm a housing lawyer. This is not legal advice. This is a general overview of the laws and policies when it comes to immigration and housing. So it really varies in terms of if someone has to have qualified immigration status by the type of program and the source of that federal funding. Some program immigration implications are subject to interpretation by a federal agency. So, right, the housing program is run by HUD. HUD makes those decisions. The federal housing program is run by the U.S. Department of Agriculture for rural communities. U.S. Department of Agriculture makes those decisions. Some programs and funds impose no immigration restrictions. And importantly, when that happens, state and local governments are not free to impose their own, though we've seen them try, especially in the last, now at this point, 8 years, that this is what we've seen. More conservative state and localities try to set their own terms on federal monies that they're receiving. This is an evolving situation. It really does now, unfortunately, change by administration what the rules may be. So let's start with sort of what are the laws. So there's two key federal programs or federal laws that guide immigration restrictions in housing. First is Title IV of the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. That's a mouthful. We call it PORA. And the second is Section 214 of the Housing and Community Development Act. Let's start with Section 214. Under Section 214, if that housing program is listed, only qualified immigrants are eligible to live in that housing. And then I'm going to give you one exception to that, but let's keep with that point. You have to be a qualified immigrant. That is primarily going to be the main federal housing programs operated by HUD and some of the USDA programs. So public housing, project-based Section 8, Section 8 vouchers, Section 236, the Rent Supplement Program, Section 23 Leased Housing Assistance, and Section 235 Home Ownership. Those are the programs, but you have to be a qualified immigrant or this other category we'll talk about in a second. However, Section 214 does not apply to Section 202, programs for the elderly, Section 811, programs for persons with disabilities, some of the HUD loan programs, the Rural 515 program, the Rural Multifamily 538 program, the Home program, the Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS program, the Community Development Block Grant program, one of now our biggest housing programs, the Low Income Housing Tax Credit program, and then the umbrella of what's called the McKinney-Vento programs, which are those homelessness assistance, supportive housing, and transitional housing programs. So how many of you have heard that new immigrants are getting into public housing and taking our vouchers? You want to raise your hand or put it in the chat if you've heard that? Sarah said she's heard it. I've definitely heard it. I think yep. So this is at this point, this would not be true. They would not be eligible for that public housing as an asylee at this point. They would not be eligible for a voucher at this point. Has anyone heard that people are jumping the wait lists? That there's a wait list. I'm in Chicago. It's decades long for the public housing program and the voucher program. And so I have heard, as if my good friend Rod Wilson that Sarah talked about, I have heard people say, I know people who've jumped the wait list. I've seen it with my own eyes. They jump the wait list. Does not happen. They are not eligible for the housing, and the wait list rules are the wait list rules. They're not jumping any wait lists. Okay, let's go to the next slides or next part. So who is a qualified immigrant under Section 214? It would be a US citizen, a lawful permanent resident, a refugee, someone granted asylum status, a parolee, a person granted withholding of removal or deportation, a person granted amnesty, and qualified victims of trafficking. That includes, in some cases, T visa holders. These are victims of trafficking. That also includes VAWA self-petitioners. These are survivors of domestic violence who were denied gaining status, typically through their spouse, and now they're able to apply on their own as a VAWA self-petitioner. There is this policy, so I said where we hold this on the side, of mixed status families under those programs subject to Section 214. So that would include that a mixed status family is where there's someone in the home with eligible immigration status, and then there are other individuals in the home who are not eligible for assistance. They, under the HUD rules, are allowed to live together as long as one person in the home has eligible status. That could include a minor child. It doesn't have to be the head of household or an adult. The rent is then prorated to reflect the number of people who are eligible in the home. So they don't get a ton of housing assistance. They're not getting as much as someone where everyone in the home has eligible immigration status. That's the rule for the HUD program. If you're in the rural housing programs, it's the same in terms of as long as the head of household has eligible immigration status, everyone can live in the home, but then they don't prorate the rent. You just pay that affordable amount as you would if you had everyone in the home with assistance. There are other restrictions under the rural development programs that are not subject to Section 214. I won't go into those in detail, but I'll just say that the RD voucher program is part of that you would have to have eligible immigration status, as is the rental assistance program that people use. Then there is, outside of Section 214, what I talked about in terms of PORA, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. So this covers certain federal pots for emergency assistance. So when new migrant families were coming into the States, one of the things that some local governments were trying to set up were emergency shelters and some form of rapid rehousing. While that main program is funded by the Emergency Solutions Grant, well, it does have immigration restrictions. Under that statute, they say if it's necessary for health and safety reasons, emergency health and safety reasons, they can provide that assistance regardless of a person's immigration status. The same is true for disaster relief. And so if it's for disaster relief, they can give out non-cash assistance, including crisis counseling, disaster legal services, shelter. And if they need to give out cash, they would give it only to the individuals in the family who are qualified. There are no immigration restrictions on the Community Development Block Grant Program. And under the emergency rental assistance programs we saw during COVID, there are also no immigration restrictions. This is where we saw a lot of state governments try to impose their own. And unfortunately, we didn't get the Treasury to be clear enough with those states that that was not permitted. However, they did say you couldn't require a Social Security number to participate in those programs. The home program also has immigration restrictions, but again, there are exceptions for the protection of life and safety, which would be applicable here. There are also immigration restrictions on the low-income heating, the LAHEAP program for energy assistance. And so they cannot give that energy assistance directly to an individual or household based upon their income, but they could do things like do heating and cooling for the entire building without income determinations. Some of the HUD programs, people often come to me with this issue. Some of the HUD programs that don't have immigration restrictions still require someone in the home to produce a Social Security number. So this is a problem where we need HUD to repeal a regulation that has that requirement, because it's creating a barrier where the statute says this person doesn't have to show their immigration status. But in that case, part of what folks can do is work with that local housing provider to see if there's some workarounds to that, which I'm happy to explain offline. I'm going to stop there because I know that's a lot of information, and just see if you have questions in the chat.
Yeah, we had a lot of really good discussion happening in the chat too, and I want to thank Sarah too for taking a lot of the questions in the chat too, because your answers are definitely a lot more eloquent than what I would have said, so I appreciate it. But we did just have some folks, and we can talk about these out loud too, because I know that the folks who watch this later won't be able to read the chat right away, but there were a lot of folks talking about, Dr. Bambi, I think, specifically talked about her experience, like actually working at a housing authority and how she had to debunk some of the myths that we're like hearing. And she did mention like the prorated rate rent that you were talking about, Kate. And then we had Juan Pablo from the Eviction Lab asking about, any challenges around it being more difficult to serve existing immigrant communities. And I know, Sarah, you kind of answered that question, but if you wanted to share a little bit more about what you put in the chat.
It's true. I mean, it's like everybody's squeezed, right? Like, that's what I was saying. Like, this is hard. Like, this is not like, oh, well, we are up against systems that do not work, or they work exactly how they were intended. They how they were intended to work. And so it's like, you're totally right. Like, groups are it's like a whack-a-mole, or like a fire hose, and you're just trying to like constantly, put out fires. It's not fair and it's not right. And I think, I don't mean to imply that like, oh, we just need to change the narrative. All I'm saying is that like, that is essential if we want to start shifting the focus of like who's responsible and who can start making, this kind of solution. That's really, it's like, yes, do the frontline work. Yes, do the Tenant Bill of Rights. And we also need to start talking about this differently so that we're not continuing the pitting against one another. Like, immigrants who have been here for a while, who need support, eviction protections, and asylum seekers, right? Like, we are the wealthiest country in the history of the universe. And like, to say like, and we still all are like, well, there's not enough. Like, there's enough. There is enough. And I think we need to start talking about there's enough if we choose it. This is about choices, budget choices, policy choices, and what kind of community we want to be. And like, that's really just important as we're doing the work and scrambling to put out the fires, to keep sort of reiterating, like, there's enough for folks who are struggling, folks who have addiction issues, folks with mental issues, folks who need caregivers. I was a caregiver for a long time for my parents. Like, that's no joke, and so I think we really need to just start reminding people that like it does not have to be like this. It's just been like this for so long that we kind of forget that.
And do you feel like this, Sarah, that given the hateful policies and rhetoric of the prior administration, it's really like changed? They've been really effective in terms of narrative change. And so even people that we've sort of longstanding had in our corner have a very different view than they probably had prior to 2016. It feels very different.
Safety and fear are really primal values. And the thing is like, we don't talk about values enough. I actually wanted to ask folks, like, what do you value? Like, what do you value about your community? What do you value personally? Like, for some people, it's like family. For some people, it's like quiet, safety, but I think politicians, again, like in an effort to not have to like take the responsibility for the situation, get to push it off on other people. And unfortunately, it's like really powerful. And so like we are up against some really nasty narratives. And that's why it's essential that we like keep kind of like countering it, not with like lecture or, or anything like that, but like, no, we have enough. Like, that's nonsense. Like anybody who's saying that to you is trying to get out of their responsibility. Right. And it's like, we have to keep saying that, because you're right, Kate. It's a us versus them. There's not enough fear-based narrative that is incredibly intoxicating to a lot of people.
And I was gonna say too, like a lot of the good discussion in the chat was also just acknowledging the fact that, it's like a lot of people do want to like address a lot of the issues that are happening across the board to folks who are citizens right now, but also trying to help other folks. And like in the end, like the goal is to help everybody and to make sure that like everybody has a place to live and that it's safe and affordable as well. So I really appreciated the discussion that was happening in the chat, and I'll see if I can share when we upload this online. If you're watching this online, I'll try to see if we can put the link to the chat itself in there so you can see some of the discussion happening as well. I think we'll have time for one more question maybe, or maybe two more, depending on your answers, but somebody in the chat was just sharing or asking if you can chat a little bit more about how this has made it more difficult for existing homeless communities or people who are experiencing homelessness.
Kate, do you have a legal like
There are not enough resources committed to addressing the affordable housing crisis, to rising rents, to persons who are unhoused. And now, and Sarah was pointing this out at the beginning, because the Supreme Court has sanctioned criminalizing people who are unhoused, regardless of their immigration status. It is a real shift, right? It's telling local and state governments, this is a tool you are authorized to use largely without penalty, rather than seek solutions to our affordable housing crisis that meet people where they're at and meet their needs. I think the question too is oriented towards, if existing individuals who are unhoused, who identify as US citizens, if their situation is worse because of the migrant crisis, I think their situation is just as bad, because we haven't solved the problem of homelessness in the affordable housing crisis in the United States, because there's been a real failure of leadership on that. And because now even Democratic governors and mayors were seeking this authorization to use criminal laws to move people out of a community if they're living outside. I don't know, Sarah, if you have thoughts on that.
Well, like first of all, we are never going to arrest our way out of homelessness or unstable housing. Like nobody is going to be able to pay their rent more easily or have a nicer, cleaner place without rodents and lead paint because we arrested somebody for being homeless. Like it's bananas. So that's one thing. Two, I want to just say, like, we often think about like the system being broken, but like here's just an analogy that we like to use, and maybe this will land with people. Like if you're in a boat and there are 10 people but 6 life vests, we don't criticize the life vests. We criticize the lack of life vests, right? And so right now we do a lot of like, well, that person got a life vest and that person got a life vest. But like at the end of the day, why weren't there 10 life vests? Like that's the focus, right? So I totally see in the chat, like I think it's like a real challenge of like, there are people who have been here who need housing and need healthcare. Like, yes, to all of that. And at the same time, people are fleeing and coming to this country as a country that has always been, although I want to like note to Jim Mohawk's point, like coming to unceded land, to say that like we can't manage or we can't have people come in functionally, it's just not true. That's like saying I'm criticizing people for you know who didn't have life vests instead of why didn't the boat operator have 10 life vests if there were going to be 10 passengers. And so I want to acknowledge like the pain and the feeling of like we're fighting for scraps and this isn't fair. And I also want to just encourage us to like reorient that story of like, rather than fighting for scraps, like what if we're arm in arm and we're saying like, no, like there is enough, we can do differently. And it's long haul work. It's really like it's decades and centuries in the making. And so it's really especially frustrating when we're feeling the urgency and like the struggle daily of people living on the streets or in Logan or in a church or, you know, in an apartment that they shouldn't be in. I don't mean to trivialize it and be like, we just need to tell different stories, but it is an important part of the work that we're doing. And most of all, to not be undercutting other groups who need safe and affordable housing. Like that's the most important part. Like we all need it. And you might work specifically for folks who have been here or work for folks to help folks who are newcomers. That's okay. We don't all need to be working towards, you know, like on the same groups of folks, but as long as our words are talking about like we all need and we can all have that. This country can make sure everybody has a safe place to live. I think that's the most important part. And then I'll stop.
No, I think that's great. And I was just going to say, I think, right, we have stigmatized affordable housing and who lives in it, and the result of, and really racialized it. And the result of that is we don't have enough and we've lost every year what we have. And so we really can play a role in combining these two narratives about there's a value in affordable housing, it stabilized families, we all need it, and we need it in our communities. We need more of it in our communities so it benefits everyone. So I think that's important. There was a question about stats. I don't have stats specifically on the percentage of immigrant families or mixed status families within public and subsidized housing. I had it somewhere. Kayla may have it from some of the work we did together, but I can't remember it. But I'll tell you this, one of the Trump administration's signature anti-immigrant policies was the public charge rule. If you got any form of federal assistance, public housing, Section 8, food stamps, Medicaid, you would be deemed a public charge and you could be deported as a result. During that whole nightmare where they terrorized immigrant families and really drove them into the shadows, it came out at the end of that policy that there were about 2 people identified as a public charge. So this idea that they're coming and they're taking all of our benefits, I really don't think that matches the reality, both because of eligibility, as what I just talked about, and because of the way that we have said that people shouldn't be eligible for those assistance, that we've stigmatized that type of assistance. So I think there's a real partnership to be made here in ending the stigmatization and racialization of affordable housing, and that we could do that as a total community.
Well, I definitely agree, and you all have had really good conversations in the chat as well. And thank you both, Sarah and Kate, for your thoughtful like remarks and just like sharing your wisdom with us and your knowledge with us. We're coming up on time, and I wish we could answer all the questions. But definitely, like, there's so many questions in there that I feel like we could dedicate like an entire Tenant Talk live to. So if y'all see that in the future, don't be surprised. But thank you again for joining us, everyone, and for the audience for being so engaging. Just a few reminders before I close us out for today. The next Tenant Talk Live, again, will be focused on the National Tenant Bill of Rights, which Kayla shared about earlier today, and it'll be on August 5th, 2024, and I'll drop that registration link in the chat for you all so you can sign up. And then, as always, we're always looking for blog post authors for our blog called On the Home Front. So if you have any story you'd like to share or any advocacy like highlights that you want to share from your tenant organization or just as a tenant leader in general, feel free to email us at outreach@nlhc.org. And then if you want to stay connected with your fellow Tenant Talk Live watchers, you can join our Facebook page, and I'll drop that link in the chat as well. And then last but certainly not least, if y'all have any feedback, if y'all want to say this was great, this was bad, this was awesome, you can always feel free to email me with any of that feedback or any other topics that y'all would like to see on Tenant Talk Live. But again, thank you so much for joining July's meeting, and we'll see you in August. Awesome. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Sid. Have a great day.
Thanks, Sid.
Thank you.